Hello, my name is Twix, and today is part 2 to a series called BFM Autism. In the last video, we talked about turn circles and turn physics, the ways that we can define our aircraft's turn, and the ways that we can use that to our advantage depending on the type of fight we're in. But today we're going to be talking about turn geometry and the ways that we can manipulate it to our advantage. Because not every fight is going to be the same. Not every fight is going to be perfect or symmetrical. They're going to be dirty and asymmetric and imperfect, much unlike the ones that we were seeing in the first video. The first concept we're going to cover is called a turning room. Now, in the last videos, we were drawing your fights as so, where one fighter comes like this, and the other fighter comes like this, with no separation, and we reach our merge and start our fight. But instead, we're going to draw it as such. Notice the distance, the range between the fighters. This is called separation, or another term is turning room. Now, we say turning room because it is room for either fighter to maneuver, to gain or lose energy, to turn, to do whatever it is that they desire. And this is owned by both fighters. And also understand that this doesn't have to be in the horizontal plane. This can be anywhere around a fighter, no matter where you are relative to the bandit. If you have distance between you and them at the pass, then that's turning room. That's separation. So, for the sake of the example, we're going to say that this fight is a one circle. And as you may recall, that means both fighters are turning nose to nose in the same direction downrange. So we have our red fighter turning like so, and our blue fighter turning like so. And keep in mind they have the same turn performance, the same radius and the same rate. But despite that, blue is still getting an advantage. And this is because of the turning room. Now, in the past, we were defining the one circle as a means of displacement, of moving downrange, where we have one fighter like so, the other fighter like so, and one turns like so, and the other one cuts in. And so as long as we can get one fighter to travel downrange more than the other, the one who travels less downrange is the one who wins. And in this case, we were doing so by reducing our velocity, and which exploited the turn radius formula. And we're doing the same thing here. It's just that instead of manipulating velocity, we're just starting further behind. So we have our red fighter traveling like so, but the blue fighter starts behind and stays behind, despite having the same velocity. And we can combine these together, where the red fighter starts out in front, but the blue fighter starts behind and reduces velocity, and thus the effect of throwing the other person out in front is even further significant. Now, this concept of turning room isn't explicit to the one circle. We can apply it to the two circle as well, and we're going to do exactly that. So instead of the red fighter turning to the north, we're going to have them turn to the south. And I'm going to do it like so, and notice something. Neither fighter has an advantage. Despite the turning room, both have equal angles. We're perfectly 180 degrees parallel to each other. We will stay that way the entire fight. And there's no radius stuff to worry about. There's no displacement because this is the two circle. We're not worried about radius. We're worried about rate. But something interesting happens if you let this fight continue, something that's different from what we saw in the past. So let's continue to draw our circles. And notice how, despite being a two circle, neither fighter is meeting in the head-on. We're always passing with this separation, and it will stay that way forever, which is different from what we saw in the first video, where one fighter turns like so, the other fighter turns like so, and we meet up in the center and thus get our opportunities for redefining or to continue. We're not getting that here because there's no close pass. And in fact, we can push this separation to the absolute extreme and make a fight that is perfectly aligned with the other fighter. So the red bandits like so, the blue bandits like so. They turn in, and we start orbiting around this shared central point, this post, and it will stay that way forever. And as long as the fighters are perfectly polar to each other, um, and if our rate is neutral, they'll stay here forever. And it's just a matter of patience and who can be more efficient and hold the rate the best. This fight is formally called the Luftberry, which is named after some World War II fighter pilot. It's one F and one R. Um, but we do see these a lot, and understanding how they work and how separation can create those can be important for manipulating the fight, in case you do want this type of fight, or in case you want to avoid this type of fight. Knowing that you have to reduce the separation can be very important. Let's look back at our original turning room example and do something different. We're still going to have the red fighter like so and the blue fighter like so with the separation, but instead of the blue fighter, or both fighters and for that matter, waiting to pass this line to start turning, we're going to have the blue fighter start turning early, like so. And I want you to notice two things. One, blue fighter has a 90-degree angles advantage to the red fighter in this direction. And two, there seems to be some range building here, where the blue fighter is behind the red. And we're going to take notes of both of those and save that for later. Another thing I want you to realize is that blue fighter has begun their turn. And as such, the centripetal acceleration that they have is already being sustained. Now, whether they're burning energy and pulling the stick really hard and thus the speed is dropping, or if they're easing the stick so they can sustain energy well on the turn, may change the fight a little bit. But again, recognize that we are actively turning while red is staying straight. Their radius is infinite because they're traveling in a straight line. Their rate is 0 because they're not turning. And when they do start turning, it'll take a moment for the G to start building up, for the centripetal acceleration to start really influencing the turn, for the radius to collapse from infinite to something definable, and for the rate to start climbing. And so if we extrapolate this fight into a two-circle, where the red fighter starts to turn to the south, and the blue fighter starts to come around, notice the blue fighter is having the angles advantage. And this is because A, we started the fight with an angles advantage already, and B, red fighter took some time to start turning, while blue had already been turning. So on top of the 90-degree angles advantage we got during the pass from this lead turn, red taking a moment to have to build up that G-force allowed blue to continue gaining angles until red matched them in rate. Okay, now what happens if red were to reverse and not, or maybe not reverse, but turn it into a one circle? Well, something else, but still interesting happens. And let's look at that. We're going to have the red fighter turn like so in the one circle, and the blue fighter turns in. Recognize the red fighter is at the disadvantage. Well, that was because of this turning room. It's the exact same as this, where the red fighter turns north and they both turn north, and despite having the same turn performance, one's cutting in behind the other. Blue fighter having turning room on red allows them to gain the advantage in the one circle. And just the same, red fighter takes a moment to start turning, and thus their radius is going to be ballooned until they start getting into the turn, which further keeps them from reducing their motion downrange. And again, we can illustrate that downrange motion. The fight is essentially symmetrical along this line, or not symmetrical, but we're traveling in this direction. And so we can draw the arrows of displacement like so. The blue fighter is starting slightly behind, the red fighter is starting in front. And so we see that the blue fighter is going to stay behind and be able to get that kill. Okay. Let's look at something else. And what I want to talk about is gravity. Gravity is a very, very, very influential part of BFM, and it affects every single aspect that we see of BFM. And the most simple way to illustrate gravity effects on our aircraft is something called the tactical egg. But I'm going to illustrate it in a slightly different way. Imagine we have an aircraft flying straight and level, right? And they enter a vertical turn, and they loop, and then exit. Now, what we're seeing is the effects of gravity. When we are on the bottom, nosing up into the climb, we are fighting against gravity. And because we are fighting against gravity, what we can imagine is our free body diagram, if you remember from physics. We have the force of lift pulling up, which we have our centripetal acceleration, um, and then we have gravity fighting against it. And because gravity is fighting against it, they destructively interfere, and thus the total centripetal acceleration, or the what is more formally called in this case the radial g, is weaker um, than it would be in a knife edging turn where we're rolling on our side, not for or against gravity. And because gravity is 1 unit of g, typically we define it as a loss of 1 g. So if we were pulling 4 g's, well, the force of gravity is 1 g, so we are getting a total of 3 g's up into the climb. But once we're on the top, it changes. We have our free body diagram. We have the force of lift, our centripetal acceleration pulling down, but we also have gravity pulling down. So if we're pulling 4Gs downwards plus gravity, they constructively interfere, causing a total of 5Gs. And so with these forces constructing together or destructing together, the performance of the turn is affected. You can think of it again as the velocity versus centripetal acceleration. And so if that total force is stronger, we're going to have a stronger AC against velocity, and thus a turn has greater performance. We're going to get a tighter radius and a quicker rate. But if we're pulling up against gravity, the radius is wider and the rate is slower. And we can apply this concept of gravity and vertical maneuvering in many ways, and it is apparent everywhere. So let's start with a very basic fight. We're not going to do any separation, any turning room stuff here. We're going to have one fighter turning nose down and one fighter nose up. This is the blue fighter is fighting against gravity currently because they're nosing up, and red fighter is nosing down with gravity. We're going to say that at the time of the merge, they're both going the same speed, and they both pull the same amount of G-force, on their stick. But of course, gravity will affect the total, radial G that we experience, which will affect the turn. And so, if we extrapolate this fight, what we see is something like this. And this is going to be a one-circle fight. Notice we see the blue fighter getting the advantage, and that's because they're now pulling with gravity over the top, nosing down. We have that centripetal acceleration pulling down with gravity, which tightens the turn, and thus, because it's a one circle, we're traveling less downrange. We're making the turn tighter. And we can see this effect happen even in the horizontal plane. Say we have a flat scissors, we have our fight like this, right? And we're going infinitely into the north. But the blue fighter being smart, we see the red fighter starting to turn into the one circle. And we know that using gravity can help impact our radius, either making it stronger or making it weaker, as in tighter or looser, respectively. So, what we can do, if we think and we be smart, is the blue fighter can climb on the way up, which makes them fight against gravity, um, which will drop their speed, and then start coming on the way down, diving. And as they are diving, they're coming over the top, nosing down with gravity, and by working with gravity they constructively interfere, and thus they get the higher radial g, that the radius is tightened. So not only did they slow down, which tightens the radius because of the u radius formula, we're using gravity to tighten the radius even further, and thus we get the advantage. And just the same, if the red fighter were to dive down here and then pull up, that's the wrong thing. And if they were to pull up here, they would be pulling down, and then which would gain them speed, widening the radius. And then as they pull up, they're fighting against gravity, which reduces from the centripetal acceleration, making the turn radius even wider. And so we see that if we're in a one-circle fight, it can be very important to utilize gravity to our advantage by pulling up and over instead of down and up. And this effect of vertical maneuvering, we can see the most significantly in the rolling scissors. The rolling scissors is, in my opinion, the most complex BFM singular maneuver or fight that one can possibly experience, because to some extent it is a combination of both the one circle and two circle, and it can fluctuate between the two depending on the geometry of the fight. And we're not going to get too much into the roller today, but just understand that, if you find yourself in a roller, try to recognize, how is gravity affecting my turns here? And, maybe create some theories on how you can utilize, this idea of radius or of utilizing gravity to, help you in that fight. That is going to be it for turn geometry. The next video I create is most likely going to be talking about sustained and instantaneous turns, which is something I hinted to in the first video. It's a very important topic towards being efficient and understanding how to turn properly, outside of just, one circle, two circle, rate radius. But there is a chance that I will also be talking about two circle geometry, as a lot of this has been focusing on one circle, but there's some very, very important concepts to understand about the two circle in order to play effectively and to not be surprised by how things can work against you if you leave them alone or don't notice them. All right, that will be all. Keep on learning.